But the reason that he's remembered and they're not is because he kind of John Byrned them. And that's me actually speaking highly of John Byrne. Oh my gosh. I heard myself there and I want to throw up a little bit.
You John Byrne them.
Conversations with your host George and Jeff. Ooh, classic comics, the classic comics from the day. Talking about old comic books is the thing that they love the best.
It's the CCF in depth.
Yes, it is. How's everybody doing?
I'm doing okay this morning.
And I am doing fantastic. I am one of your hosts, Jeff Heller.
I'm George Nieves, the other one.
And we have our special... Oh, go ahead. Our special guest today is...
I'm James, and I'm known as Spoon on the boards.
He most certainly is. Today's topic is we were talking about Wolverine's first 25 years of evolution as a character and the creators who made it happen. And this kind of is stemmed out of a conversation we've been having both behind the scenes, a little bit in our episodes recently, of this idea now that Roy Thomas co-created Wolverine. It's creating a huge series of waves and controversies in the comic book community. What constitutes a creator? Who is a creator? What does it mean to create a character? There was already some debate as to whether, Len Wein and Herb Trimpe deserved the full credit, or whether it went to, John Romita, or did Chris Claremont and Frank Miller have ownership in there. But in our conversation today about how Wolverine has changed and evolved over his first 2.5 decades, what we're also going to be getting into is really the question of what is Wolverine's appeal and who gave it to him? Is it more important who said the character's name first, or wrote or drew the character first, or who made the character beloved? Who made the character famous and important and a lifelong fan favorite? So as we get into this today, we've brought James aboard because James is the most prolific writer about 1970s X-Men on the board. He's passionate about it. He knows his stuff well, and he has a lot to say about Wolverine, both as a team member and as a solo. And even just sitting down to talk to James before this episode, the wealth of knowledge he brought blew our minds. So George and I are probably going to mostly sit here with our mouths open gaping as James drops some serious knowledge today. But before we get into the whole story of Wolverine's creation and how he's evolved in that time, one interesting thing I wanted to address is I really cannot believe that Roy Thomas or Jim Shooter or anyone who followed didn't see a problem with having a hero whose power was claws. Because, in a Comics Code approved book, you can't show blood. Wolverine's claws can never actually connect except for off panel. How do you do that issue after issue? And they find ways to, they really do, but it's such a weird thing. It's like when they did the Ninja Turtles cartoon and they had to make the foot soldiers robots because all their weapons are so flipping violent. You can't have them doing that to people.
It's almost like a character like Swordsman. If I had $1 for every time Swordsman hits somebody with the flat of his blade instead of slicing them, I might be able to afford Hulk 181.
Yeah, that's like I'm reading through Defenders right now, and Valkyrie is always saying, I'm striking them with the flat of my blade.
Right?
Nothing's getting pierced here. But, it's kind of like the Comics Code Authority. It parallels a little bit with the movies, the production code, because, they would have sex and violence in movies, but it would be through innuendo. And, a little bit with Wolverine, you show stuff off panel, you have a snicked sound effect, you imply things.
You're referencing X-Men 116. When they're in the Savage Land and and there's a sentry guarding this area and they tell him, okay, let's do that, and he says, don't worry, I handle this. And then, like you said, off panel his snick, but you see the guy's body on the ground with blood on his hand. It's pretty obvious what he did there. He killed him in cold blood.
I mean, you can take that back to Hulk 181, his battle with the Wendigo, where he's very, very clearly clawing him up, but the artwork can't show that. And in fact, I was going to talk about that later on. Here's Wein's amazing narration to show you what's happening because the visuals couldn't. With the savage ferocity of the creature for which he is named, the Wolverine hurls himself upon the furry nightmare. There is a shrill hissing as his adamantium talons flash through the air, a sickening thwack as they strike. You could almost argue, I have not researched this enough for it to be a tinfoil hat theory, but you could argue that one of the appeals of Wolverine is the artists had to really sell the violence because they couldn't show the claws hitting. So it was either going to be he looks completely pointless, or you give your best art possible to imply what's happening because you can't show it.
Jeff, maybe you hit him with the flat of the blade.
I mean that's another. We could have a whole different discussion about the nature of his claws, because you have artists drawing them, like rounded. They come to a point, and then you have like.
McFarlane?
Yeah, you have McFarlane, the famous Incredible Hulk 340, where they're all flat, but
This is a tension right from the get-go. When we want to talk about the original concept for Wolverine, I don't think Roy Thomas gave it this much thought. All he said, according to him, is, I need you to make a character named Wolverine. I need you to make him Canadian. I want him to be fierce, and I want him to be short. And then John Romita does a mock-up drawing and gives him claws. You've got a character who was intended from the start to be a hero. Yes, he's originally introduced as a sort of villain, but the intention from the beginning was for him to be a hero in the Marvel Universe. And you've said, make him fierce, and you've given him claws. This is going to be an issue.
Yeah.
The claws are problematic, like you said. There's no reason why really somebody would have claws unless they were going to be the aggressor.
Well, that's the thing is, when we're talking about, creatorship, who created what. Roy Thomas, call him Wolverine, make him Canadian, make him fierce, make him short. You can make what you want of that. It's John Romita adding the claws, I think, is huge, not just for the iconic look of it, but for what it does to a character. You have anybody fighting superpowered beings, and they have claws on their gloves, because remember, originally the gloves were removable, the claws were originally supposed to be part of the gloves. They weren't supposed to be a part of Wolverine until much later on. But you have a character who's chosen to go into combat with claws. That says something right there. And also, in the heat of the moment, he's going to use them sometimes.
Yeah.
They weren't retractable originally, right?
Yeah, I think they were. Well, actually,
I don't
the whole comic book, they were just always out.
Yeah, I don't think they retract in the original appearances. So if he ever throws a punch, he's going to take somebody's eyeball
but
out.
How did he wipe his butt?
He took the glove off, I would hope.
Yeah, he just reaches out and does it. But I mean, they do give some hints early on that, hey, maybe this is not the guy that you want to entrust these weapons to. Because I'm looking at a panel where they have the military guys looking to deploy him, and they say, the government has spent a great deal of time, effort, and money developing that mutant's natural-born speed, strength, and savagery into the skills of a professional warrior. Despite the few kinks still remaining in his psychological makeup, I think we've done a pretty good job. A few kinks in his psychological makeup. So, what are those kinks? What are those kinks? Don't worry about it. But,
my headcanon always told me that's why they chose him, was because he was a little bit berserk.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Roy Thomas, the issue with that is it's sort of a little bit of the debates with Stan Lee in terms of, he might put out a concept or say that he did, and there's a lot of execution that goes into it. Like, is a concept enough, and how basic a name and things like that? Because there's a question of even the name itself. Is that something that originated with Thomas? Because again, if you look at the X-Men Companion, in the interviews with Cockrum, who ended up coming up with a lot of names, designs, and sketches that he had been working at DC, bringing them over to Marvel, and becoming the seeds of the characters that were introduced to Giant Size X-Men 1. He says part of the things that he had in his sketchbook was a character called Wolverine, and that he had shown that to Roy Thomas. Now, to be clear, Cockrum is not saying he came up with, this character, Logan, the Wolverine that we know. It's a feisty guy. He says he had fangs, but he didn't have any claws. and his haircut was similar, but he was a different character. So he says, maybe Roy Thomas forgot that I brought up this name of a character, but there's a question of, Roy Thomas, was he drawing upon like something he actively remembered? Was it something that faded into the background of his memory? So even though he's not a character that Cockrum created, did Cockrum sort of put in the seeds here of like, hey, here's a name for a character, Wolverine, and if you look up the animal itself, it sort of suggests a little bit of that personality of feistiness.
Well, Jeff, I went down a rabbit hole, and James, I went down a rabbit hole with this as far as, things being copied or whatever, and I think Jeff, you owe me an apology because you jumped all over me the last podcast when I suggested that Deadpool was created by Rob Liefeld. You said, "Oh no, he was a copy of Slade and this and that." And I'm like, not for nothing, but everything's a copy of everything. I was looking at this Wolverine character, and guess what? 1964, Timberwolf was created. He was called from the Legion of Superheroes. He wasn't created. He was created by two people I don't really know. I think their name is John Forte and Edmund Hamilton. 1964 Legion of Superheroes. He was called Lone Wolf, and then later on, by the time 1970, I think Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes 197 have a cover of somebody that looks just like Wolverine in that brown costume, and he has the same hairstyle and everything else. And he has very similar powers: healing, super fast, agile, tracking. The only thing he didn't have was like the adamantium. So I'm thinking, well, yeah, things. It's not that you're copying or stealing. It's just that things get. You'll look at something and you'll say, okay, let me take these elements from it and put a tweak on it and make my own character. So when you say that something like Deadpool's a copy, I'm like, well, he made him an assassin that has a big mouth, like a Spider-Man. Liefeld said he copied more from Spider-Man than anything. He said he put a guy with a big mouth that had a joke for everything he was doing, and that was his tweak on it. Now, of course, it's influenced by something else, just the same way any character is influenced by Superman and Batman. But that doesn't mean you're stealing it. Again, I wouldn't say Wolverine's a copy of, or they stole it from Timberwolf, although there's a lot of things that are similar. But, I mean, the reason why Wolverine is such a big character is because they added personality traits that maybe other characters didn't have. I think that later on they made Timberwolf a little feisty also, but not to a point, where the way Wolverine is, I mean, he'll kill you, That was a big difference.
I don't disagree with you, George, in the sense that when we get into the question of who created and whether or not that's even a valid question to ask, whether it matters more who first came up with the basic concept or who really made the concepts endurable and lovable and amazing. We haven't even gotten there yet, but I do think there's a huge difference between creating a character with unintentional similarities to another character, creating a character that is maybe subconsciously or subliminally borrowing from another character without intending to, blatantly stealing from another character but making it different enough, or taking an assassin named Slade Wilson and then making a new assassin named Wade Wilson and cashing in on that. I think there's a huge difference there.
Well, their personalities are different, and everything about them is different. Just the name. You want to latch onto the name, okay? What can I say? But I'm thinking, you come up with your own tweak on something and you make it different in a lot of different ways. You don't, I mean, comic books is like the only place where you could just copy somebody and call him Supreme, and like he's Superman, but a son of a bitch Superman, and you own him.
I mean,
go ahead, James.
I was gonna say, as far as Timberwolf and the Legion, I'm not exactly sure of like the various steps in his evolution, but my feeling is, at least with the Timberwolf stuff that I've read, he wasn't as nuanced and developed as a character, so I don't think he really had as much the the tension with the psychopath there. But again, when he's being further redeveloped from his Silver Age origins and developed in the 70s, you have Dave Cockrum actually. That was back in his Legion days. So
Yep.
you kind of have Cockrum drawing upon himself because later on then, right, during his first run on X-Men, you had the X-Men fighting doppelgangers of the Legion of Superheroes and the Shire Imperial Guard, and you actually have Wolverine fighting Timberwolf's doppelganger named Fang, and
Yes.
he takes his costume. So he's sort of recycling from Fang, who's recycled from Timberwolf, and taking some of that on for Wolverine because he only keeps that costume for a short time. But there's little elements of that I think were in Wolverine's second costume when he gets a little bit into the brown and tan.
And I always assumed, and I have no reason to believe this, but I always assumed that Cockrum wanted to keep that costume, and then ultimately that was rejected for one reason or another. But it's worth bringing up too that Nightcrawler was originally a concept he had for the Legion that ended up getting turned into the X-Men instead. So
Yeah.
he definitely had the Legion in mind throughout the all new, all different X-Men.
A lot of the
Yeah.
artistic creators have a whole like binder of characters they've created and looks and motivations, and they carry it around with them forever until the right time to come out or sell it to a company or use it or whatever.
Sure.
That's what all of them do. So, I mean, again, comic books is the only place where you could copy something, and there's no issue anymore. I mean, I know there used to be an issue at the beginning when Captain Marvel Shazam came out. DC sued the pants off Fawcett, but they don't do that anymore. It's just like you can't do anything. You have a copy or what looks like a copy, and fight it out in the newsstands. What can I say?
And you could argue actually that DC Superman stole more from Captain Marvel than Captain Marvel stole from Superman, but that's a whole other issue.
Again, who came
But,
first though is what came first. That
Is it though?
It is because Fawcett got killed. DC just sued him into oblivion.
Superman didn't have the power set he has now. That came from Captain Marvel. He couldn't even fly originally.
He could leap tall buildings in a single bound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They ripped that all off from Captain Marvel. But anyway, let's go a little further with where we're supposed to be going. Let's talk about Hulk 181 through 182 and Len Wein and Herb Trimpe's influence on that. James, are you comfortable leading that part?
Yeah. I mean, I think I don't want to overstate the importance of those issues, but the idea had been percolating to revive the X-Men. Um, and you'll notice back in those issues when they're talking, you have the military guys talking about this guy that they're going to deploy. Um, he's referred to as Wolverine mostly by himself, but they also refer to him as Weapon X. So it's very interesting. They're already using that X motif that came up a lot way back in issue 1. Professor X is talking about they have an extra power, extra ability. So there had been this idea percolating, with Roy Thomas, a little bit with Len Wein about reviving the X-Men, making them like an international group. Um, Funnily enough, humorously enough, let's say, there's comparisons made to the Blackhawks, the group that came over to DC, I guess from another publisher,
Quality, I
where they
think.
were, sorry?
Quality comics. I think owned
Yes, Quality Comics. Then it becomes a DC book, and they're an international group of soldiers from different countries. So, the idea is like make him a mutant, make him from another country, Canada, and set him up with this background. And they do hint a little bit about, hey, maybe he's a little bit has a little bit of a screw loose where they're talking about his psychological background. But there, you deploy him against the Hulk and Wendigo. You really don't have him, acting so aggressively towards human characters. So I don't think you really have him developed as much of the anti-hero persona than you do starting off with, let's say, Giant Size X-Men 1, where you have Cockerman there to play. So in terms of Trimpe, since the design comes from Romita, and you have a little bit of the context for the character, coming from the writing, I don't see that much coming from Trimpe, to be honest.
I think for Trimpe, I would say, I think the biggest thing that makes his art, well, not his argument, but anyone's argument that he co-created Wolverine weak, is the fact that Wolverine's first appearance in 180, that one single panel, Trimpe was either copying or tracing directly the sketch Romita gave him. If you ever look up, if you just Google right now, Romita's original sketch of Wolverine, it is exactly that image in the final panel of Hulk 180. What Trimpe does add in 181 that I do respect, I think he does make Wolverine's fighting style look incredibly savage. When Wolverine leaps at the Wendigo, it looks bad. It looks way more intense in a comic code friendly way than you normally see in a superhero comic book, even without showing the claws striking, because he couldn't do that. So I think Trimpe gave Wolverine a lot of his ferociousness, but I wouldn't call that creatorship in any stretch. I think that's just him fulfilling what was already laid out by first Thomas saying make him fierce and Romita giving him claws.
Sounds good to me.
How about Wein?
So, Len Wein, we have him doing this introduction in the pages of Incredible Hulk, and he does giant size X-Men. He plots, the first couple of issues of the revival of X-Men, and Claremont finishes with a script. But I kind of joke about Len Wein's X-Men, not to denigrate the contributions of someone who did a lot, but you have the first couple of issues of X-Men. You have giant size and the issues that he plotted. And Claremont did a lot of different things with characters than what Len Wein started off with. So that's, I think, where we get into debates over creatorship. I think a lot of fans, maybe they feel they're sort of selling out the creators or taking the corporate side if they sort of don't credit the people that write the first story with really creating them. But it really is like a collaborative medium. You have someone write that first story, and Claremont takes so many of these things in different directions from where Wein started out with.
I'm of the opinion that the person that comes up with the idea and of the character is the creator, period. Doesn't matter what you add later on. That person, you can't add something to something that doesn't exist.
But you can take a nothing character that was going to go nowhere and add new twists to it that make it suddenly appealing. In a way, I look at it as like coaching a professional athletic team. Who created the Cleveland Indians / Guardians versus which coach brought them to a championship. Starting something doesn't necessarily make it any good. It just puts it there. If I create a character right now and I call him Super Dan, and no one does anything with Super Dan for 30 years, and suddenly in 30 years somebody else picks up Super Dan and makes it a beautiful existential exploration of patriotism, I didn't do that.
You didn't create it either. All you did was write a story for Super Dan.
You do have Len Wein from Giant Size X-Men 1. He and Cockrum are adding new stuff. Because there you have when Professor X comes to recruit Wolverine and he just walks out on the Weapon X program. His superior officer, he just slices through the guy's necktie. That's a little bit of starting the, hey, here's this edge, here's this violence, here's this temper, and he's unleashing it against not the Hulk, not Wendigo, but this guy who is not in any position to really defend himself. So he is starting those threads that Claremont is gonna pull on and Cockrum as well when he continues with Claremont.
Yeah, when I try to ask myself, is Wein a creator of Wolverine? What does it mean to be a creator, and why does it even matter? But if we're trying to figure out who deserves the credit, so to speak, for Wolverine's enduring appeal, if you look at Wolverine without Chris Claremont, first of all, let's not forget the ferocity came from Thomas, the claws came from Romita, but what you get is originally a guy that feels like Spider-Man to me. In fact, he's kind of fascinating because it's weird how he goes from being this wisecracking, silly, jovial guy to, having this sickening description of, thwacking his claws into Wendigo's chest. But, I think my favorite line he gives in 181 is, "I'll just keep moving if you please, because moving is the thing I do best." I mean, that is so far from who the Wolverine we love is. The powers he gave him in that issue, he seems to have speed and dexterity. Definitely no healing factor. Knockout gas knocks him out. Definitely no indestructible bones. I think he cracks a couple ribs. Wein does add the adamantium. He does make it clear that that Wolverine's claws are made of adamantium. But of course, at that point, the claws were still supposed to be part of the glove, not part of the man. But I do want to point out, James, I think you're absolutely around the ball. I think where Wein does deserve credit is that moment where he slices the tie of the general. I think that is the first moment we see a character who is unstable and unreasonably aggressive to everybody. And weirdly enough, for the next two issues, Wolverine goes on to follow orders respectfully, report back to Cyclops. He doesn't behave like that in those two issues after, but I think that does lay enough groundwork to call him a sort of creator. That unnecessary moment where we're first really getting a sense of who Wolverine is, and those establishing shots that he slices his tie and essentially threatens violence against him, I think that is very much the Wolverine we've come to love ever since. And that alone, ignoring Hulk 180 and 182 entirely, 180, 181, and 182, I think that moment in Giant Says X-Men #1 is an important contribution that does put Wein on the radar as a meaningful contributor and creator.
Yeah, or know and love, or in George's case.
Well, thank you. Thank you for giving Wein some credit. He's the creator, period. So you got to give credit to the person that did it. Hey, if I bring a piece of ground beef to your house, and you season it up, and you put all kinds of nice things, who was the one that bought the ground beef? It was me. Even with the seasoning, it still didn't turn to anything. Seasoning by itself couldn't do a thing.
Except that Roy Thomas is the one who ordered the ground beef, and then John Romita is the one who brought it to Len Wein's house. I give
them those three the credit: Thomas, Wein, and Romita.
So, what is your definition of a creator, George?
Person that comes up with the concept.
But Wein didn't come up with the concept.
Yes, he did.
What part of the concept did Wein come up with?
Thomas told him create somebody, the name Wolverine. And the Wolverine implying take the attributes of a Wolverine animal and do something with it, and he did.
Yeah.
I mean, they were actually wanted to make. From what I read, they thought that Colossus would be the main star of the show, because that's why you see him in all the covers. He's prominent in most of the early covers, and Cockrum thought Nightcrawler, who, by the way, is another crappy character, was going to be the star of the show, and no one cared about that. I mean, you say, I don't see what anybody sees in Nightcrawler. That's a very boring character.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just kind of I feel bad for you.
There's a lot to go off in there, so it's what thread to go off? I mean, first, maybe the more simple one. Yes, you really do see from the cover designs that Colossus was going to be the star. But when you have this big roster for a team, usually on a lot of these covers, they would have maybe 5 characters, and they leave 1 or 2 out. And you have so many early covers where Wolverine is one of the couple of guys that gets left off the cover, or he's really tiny in the background. So it was not. Again, if we're trying to say what was Wein's vision for the series, I think he had an idea to set Colossus up, or editorial as well, and not so much Wolverine. And I mean Claremont too.
James. Sorry,
go ahead.
I have to stop you, James. This is you proved my point. You're saying that Claremont had a lot to do with Wolverine. He wasn't even featuring him in the book. I mean, he didn't care about that guy. It wasn't until Byrne came along that he kind of became the star. And as for Colossus, My point is that he was a strong man of the book, and usually comic books like the strong man. They like Superman. They like Thing. They like those people you can put them on the cover because they become like the star of the book. That's what they wanted. The early X-Men, the original version, they didn't have a strong man. And maybe you could say Hank, the Beast, but they didn't have this guy that's gonna come in like Thor and watch out. You guys are gonna get your butts kicked now. So this is what they were trying to sell, and again, Wolverine was so little thought of by Chris Claremont that it was between him and Thunderbird to get killed in that second issue. I mean, they're kind of both like similar characters, personality-wise, hothead type, but they ended up killing Thunderbird, and they kept Wolverine, and thank God. They wouldn't have a movie coming out in a couple of weeks now.
Well, just to clarify, wasn't it Wein who killed Thunderbird, not Claremont?
Yeah, I mean that first story, that Count Nefaria, Cheyenne Mountain story, that's plotted by Wein. As far as I know, he's at least credited as plotter with Claremont scripting. So I think that was baked in by Wein in terms of who was gonna die. I mean,
Supposedly, Wein had planned from the start to kill one of them off right away as a way of letting readers know the stakes were higher now and nothing was safe and anybody could die.
yeah.
So X-Men 96 is when Claremont has the reins, and we suddenly see a huge change in behavior for Wolverine. We see him, the psychotic aspect is played up immensely. We have him being described as push him too far and he goes mad, and when he does, he kills. At later on in the point, Cyclops says to him, "I've just about had it with your mad killer act, pal." And Wolverine says, "It's no act, leader man." And of course, we have that point early in the issue where Nightcrawler's mocking Wolverine, and Wolverine almost like guts him for it. So suddenly, out of nowhere, he's this complete and total loose cannon. I know when we talk about Byrne later on, we're going to say that Byrne is the one who pointed more for Wolverine to sort of be this unleashed monster. But Claremont and Cockrum put it right there in the beginning. It's X-Men 96. It's there right from the start.
And so I think that there's a couple of things at work there. Cockrum, with the interviews that he was giving in that X-Men Companion, why he wasn't so into Wolverine is he thought his characterization was a little inconsistent, and there's a sense. It's kind of hard to tell exactly where the editorial versus, a writer thing comes into play with that scene with Nightcrawler where Wolverine almost guts him, because he gets upset about kind of being made fun of in the Danger Room. But that's a little bit of that early inconsistency in terms of like when he gets angry, is he just gonna unleash it against villains, or is he gonna go and maybe kill or hurt his friends? And I think Claremont, when he talks about his work, he says that's one of the issues that he was, least thrilled, most disappointed about looking back. But another thing with the conflict with Cyclops is you see how Wolverine played out in those early Claremont Cockrum issues. He was really not shown as nearly as formidable, the guy that would have a following. When he came into conflict with Cyclops, Wolverine tended to be in the wrong, and he ended to get the short end of the stick. Cyclops would put him in his place, basically. So he's not the type of guy that you would see becoming sort of a megastar there. He's the GOAT, not in greatest of all time, but the laughing stock there. And even when he comes into this fight, he slashes up Pirok, this giant demon. It's like, wow, Wolverine finally did something, even though we're only a few issues into the series. And then he overestimates the damage he does because this demon pops back up and starts fighting again.
James, you mentioned evolution, but what they did with Wolverine is like they did Superman. They kept adding powers to him like every couple of issues or whatever. Superman starts leaping. Next thing you know, he's flying, moving planets around. They kind of did the same thing with Wolverine. Every time somebody came along, he became more popular. they took the mystery away, So that's but early on, we really don't know what any of the characters are, and the fact that he would turn on somebody that you say was his friend. I don't think he's friends with anybody in the early going with the X-Men. He's just there because he thinks he could get something from Professor X, and he's like just trying to get along with some of the people there who he views as strangers. So I don't see that relationship yet.
I think you bring up a couple important things, George, and one of those in terms of his powers being added onto over time. He doesn't have any defined powers in the beginning of the Claremont X-Men run at all. He's got the claws, but we have no idea what makes him a mutant. Because at that point, the assumption, even the characters assume, the claws are part of his gloves. So we don't know what his mutant abilities are. We don't know anything about his personality. George, you brought up his motivation for joining the X-Men. We don't know what his motivation is, other than the fact that the General didn't want him to. He's a completely...
I thought in the giant size, Professor X kind of said, "Look, there's a lot of gaps in your memory that I can help you with." Well,
I thought that was.
Am I getting that from the movie? But it wasn't
so.
It wasn't in giant size, also.
I don't think so.
No, there wasn't anything about the gaps in his memory. I flipped.
There has to be a reason given. There has to be a reason given why he joins.
The General tells him not to, and so he does it, and that's the whole reason.
But he's considering it before the General tells him not to. He's considering it, and there's a reason why he's considering it.
Yeah. So Professor X tells him he needs desperate need of mutants, which ends up being the plan to free the original team from Krakoa. But he also says, quote, "I'm offering you a chance to become a free agent, a chance to learn to put your powers to the greatest use." And Wolverine responds by talking about getting out of, from red tape. So basically, like it's more of a sense of Wolverine being very constrained under this government structure, this military structure. And in the school, he can do more of what he wants.
But of course, go ahead. The joke of that is he could just walk off any time. If he doesn't want to be restricted and confined, he doesn't need to stay with the X-Men. And they don't bother to explore why he does stay with the X-Men in the early issues.
But also, you're talking about like his fifth appearance, so like, give him a break, to develop what his personality actually is and his history actually is. You don't know anything about him. So the fifth, the 3 Hulk issues and maybe 2-3 X-Men issues, you shouldn't know everything about him. Things should unfold.
Sure, but the point being that this stemmed out of an idea that you'd said, George, is that essentially Claremont doesn't know what to do with him and doesn't seem to want to do much with him. That he goes through a lot of issues before we get any idea what his powers are, before we get any idea what his motives are, or who he is as a person, or before that mask even comes off. It really seems like they didn't know what to do with him and didn't want to do anything with him until much later on.
It makes me wonder, Byrne he championed Wolverine, and Cockrum championed Nightcrawler. I was wondering, who was Claremont championing? Was he like the big fan of Storm, or was it Colossus? I don't know.
He definitely favored Storm in a lot of places. She gets a lot of attention. Colossus got a lot of attention too, and Cyclops got a lot of attention. I feel like those were, in the early issues, the 3 characters who were developed the most often and given the most narrative perspective.
Claremont was really into Storm.
I'm just going to add this. It didn't hurt also that she was walking around nude in a couple of those issues, so that made me a fan.
Well, and I know you say that in partially in jest, but beyond even just the physical appeal of her, I feel like one of Claremont's strengths. I've always felt that Claremont does his best writing in between moments, and I feel like when he really nailed the characters. Sorry, that was the wrong phrasing after what George just said. But
I'd like to.
I feel like when he really figured out who the characters were was when he figured out where they like to be in their free moments. And for Storm, it was that moment in her attic apartment where she lets the rainstorm come and just floats in the middle of it all naked. It wasn't just sexy. It was also, this is who this character is. And, when we get to Byrne and Wolverine, we'll talk about a little bit more where I think they first find who Wolverine is in his off moments too. But it's those between scenes moments that he really fleshes his characters out. And he seemed to really enjoy doing that, particularly for Storm, and showing Cyclops trying to do that and utterly failing at it right from the first panel of X-Men 96.
Yeah.
So just to talk a little bit further about Claremont and questions of creatorship or what was contributed, one important idea Claremont had that we didn't end up using or was the idea first, I think, hinted at in X-Men number 98 when Wolverine is being studied. And the comment that's being made is, let me see if I can find it again. It says something to the extent of, you don't read anything like any other mutant I've ever seen before. And that's because, as Claremont has explained in interviews, the original concept he had, or I don't know about original, the concept he had at that point was that Wolverine was going to end up being an actual Wolverine who'd been mutated by the High Evolutionary. That was the backstory he was ultimately going to introduce. And they moved away from that. But in terms of what Claremont did for Wolverine before Byrne comes on board, I know, George, you're going to go back to the point again that he didn't start the ball rolling. But let's at least discuss what Claremont added to keep that ball in motion. Even though he neglected Wolverine for a lot of the early run, what did Claremont do before Byrne that was good for Wolverine?
I mean, he creates a little bit of the vulnerability and the love triangle here because Jean gets irradiated, ends up emerging from Jamaica Bay as the Phoenix, and she's hospitalized. They show that he has this crush on Jean. He brings flowers to her. He's sort of an outsider because he thinks he's going to visit her and he's going to be able to go in, and the whole team is there. And he sort of gets brushed aside, or he's really not interested in mingling with people. He has this inner life and attraction to her. So Claremont and Cochrane, before Byrne come on, or really before Claremont develops this years later, in the wake of other events there, they kind of have him as the odd man out. He's a little bit of a stalker there, rather than like someone where there might be mutual attraction with a love triangle. But he does get the Wolverine and Jean ball rolling.
I always felt that love triangle felt tacked on. It seemed like totally out of nowhere. Like there'd been no clue that Logan felt that way earlier on. It felt cheap to me. But I did respect the idea of trying to humanize him more. I kind of think that Claremont's biggest contribution to Wolverine prior to Byrne was less in what he did to develop Wolverine and more in how he used Wolverine as a contrast for the rest of the team. I think having this one guy on the team who's constantly going off to drink beers and is super violent and never socially reacts the way in which you expect him to helped define who the other team members were in response. Whereas a normal person would just yell at him and get pissed off. How they each try to understand him and work with him and reach him in a way. It was an experiment less in being dark and more in what heroes do in response to darkness. In a way, part of the battle, part of the struggle of the X-Men, I suppose, was could they save Wolverine? Could they get him off this path where he was inevitably at some point either going to murder somebody or, go Incredible Hulk with the Avengers, as a parallel to that and sort of become the villain who rushes off and they have to go find him. The fact that they were able to keep him on the team and generally keep him from turning into a villain was a huge part of what made them great.
Yeah. I mean, you have sort of the contrast when you go into the very beginning of Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, right? There's all these stories, whether it's the Blob or Unis the Untouchable, that people show up on Cerebro with Professor X, and they try to bring in these folks to train them in their abilities, and they become these evil mutants. And, in theory, if it was a Silver Age story, like Wolverine could just be a psycho that just doesn't want to play nice with others and he goes over the edge. They wouldn't be so straightforward about psychopathy, but he does merge with the team and you do have him as a foil. Cyclops is more of your straightforward hero and Wolverine's your anti-hero. And like to have this anti-hero to work, you've got to not just have him fight villains, but have conflicts with other heroes.
Yeah, and I think the magic of him is what he pulls out of other characters. I think Claremont finding him playing that role on the X-Men, it took a while to get there. At first, I think Claremont felt the same way towards Wolverine that some of the characters did, but once they begin to begrudgingly love him and want to try to help him and want to try to understand him, I think that became his magic. I think it's, when Justice League had Guy Gardner play that role only a few years later, I kind of feel like they were aping off of this a little bit, that it brings a new tension to the team and helps define your characters better by having this one character who absolutely shouldn't be a hero that they're trying to raise up along with them.
Yeah, and I mean, you see that later on, and this is chronologically a little later, but when you bring Kitty in, and it's this strange tension, this is the gruff guy, but when you pair him with younger characters, sometimes he really embraces this mentorship role. They do that with Jubilee down the line. So
Sure.
it's this weird thing where he can be tough, but if he feels like there's a space to be a mentor, he jumps into that. I don't think that would have happened during, the Claremont Cockrum first run, but after
Yes.
they've broadened the character out and sort of put him more in the foreground. That's the story's more capable of moving in that direction.
I think once Claremont created that dynamic between Wolverine and the rest of the team, the inevitable next step was the character had to show some signs of softening
Mm.
over time, or else where's this going? And so that does make sense ultimately. I think you can take it too far. I think sometimes Wolverine is too much of the default softy beneath the gruff exterior that doesn't feel earned.
Yeah.
I think the movies are sometimes very, very, and the cartoon as well. They use that a little bit too easily sometimes.
Yeah.
But you know what? While we're talking Kitty Pryde anyway, why don't we get to talking John Byrne? Unless, George, was there anything you did want to say about Claremont's era with Wolverine?
No, you guys covered it.
Okay. Then, well, George, since this is an era you care a little bit more about, do you want to start on John Byrne?
Alrighty. And you can see, since he was Canadian himself, he sort of gravitated to the Wolverine character. He made him a lot more vicious on a regular basis than Cockrum and Claremont have done. Now, the thing with Kitty Pryde, if I remember correctly, she came in, she was like 13 or something, and I don't remember really much about him mentoring her. I think that comes later on. According to Byrne, he would have been okay with him like cutting her in pieces over some breakfast cereal or whatever. But
that was my favorite anecdote. The idea that he saw that as an inevitability one day that they'd come down to breakfast and Wolverine had totally disemboweled Kitty. But of course, they could never actually do that.
I mean, he became a superstar with Byrne. The two things I mentioned earlier, issue 116 where he kills the guard, and 132 where he comes out of the sewer and he says, "It's my turn now."
Yeah.
I heard that one page went for like $100,000.
Oh, I
Something
believe
crazy
that.
like that. Some big money, that one page.
Well, and this goes back to your idea of creatorship in a way, George, with John Byrne. People always say that John Byrne really raised the X-Men run to a whole new level. And to some extent, that's true. I do like his art better. He did have some creative contributions that were incredibly helpful. But one other point of that was just that, as Claremont and Cockrum's X-Men was getting better and drawing more attention and figuring out what it was more, how much of that success, both for the team and for Wolverine, would it have achieved even without a John Byrne? But certainly Byrne drew some badass Wolverine moments. He championed Wolverine. He cared about Wolverine when Claremont wanted to get rid of the character. That most certainly is true. James, what do you have to say about John Byrne?
So, I mean, a big part of it is just developing Wolverine as not a screw up, as being more competent, because during the Cockrum era, he would mess up, he would be overconfident a lot. I mean, John Byrne had the Mesmero story. He had Wolverine be able to overcome the brainwashing that Mesmero had done for different people. He's the one that is breaking out and aiding the rest of the X-Men to escape. And, when he does the story where Weapon Alpha, who would later become Guardian and Vindicator, shows up, he's building on this backstory. He's also has this scene where Wolverine's talking to Storm about hunting, and Storm's very judgmental about that, and maybe rightfully so with her bond for nature. But he says, "I'm just walking up to the deer. I'm just seeing that I can approach it without it noticing." So Byrne is trying to say, hey, this guy, let's just not make him the screw up, the loose cannon that gets put in place with Cyclops. Let's show that he has like actual skills and contributions to the team. He gets his licks in, whether it's going rogue in the battle against Magneto in Antarctica and getting a few licks in, fighting with Sauron, giving him a backstory with the Alpha Flight story where the whole team shows up, and a very memorable scene where he agrees to go with Alpha Flight. That ends the fight. The X-Men are leaving. Turns out Wolverine has escaped on his own and stowed away back into that. It's like he's thinking outside the box, and he's not just using his rage. He's not going to fight until he wins. He's going to make Alpha Flight think they won and escape. So he's really more depth and layer and competence than the Claremont Cockrum combo ever allowed him to have.
Yeah. I was mentioning earlier how I think Claremont defines his characters best and how they use their downtime. And you mentioned a moment ago the moment that made me first start caring about Wolverine. And while I will always feel that Wolverine is an overrated character, but the first moment where I truly began to love him is that moment tracking the doe, where he is tracking it but has no intention of killing it. He's actually trying to understand it instead. And I don't remember, I tried to find what issue that came from. I don't honestly remember. Do you know, James?
It is 109, I believe.
Okay, because I was trying to figure out. Okay, good. That's important to me because that moment not only illustrates his skill, it also illustrates his internal duality. That on the one hand, he is a violent monster, an animal. On the other hand, he very much wants to not be that animal. By tracking the doe but having no intention of killing it whatsoever, it shows a side of him that wants to control the animal. And I feel like that inadvertently sets the stage for what Claremont and Miller will later do in the Wolverine miniseries. This idea of Wolverine's battle to control himself that we hadn't seen earlier on. He just seemed like a total loose cannon. And here we see a character instead who can achieve harmony by trying to use his animal instincts, but rein in his darker animal impulses.
Yeah, and it is 109. It's Byrne's second issue of X-Men. And already Wolverine is getting much more like depth and positive attention, than ever before. Right from the get-go, he wants to show Wolverine as like an important foregrounded character. He's not getting left off the covers now.
Can I add something to what the two of you guys are saying? First of all, Jeff mentioned that the X-Men book was taking off and all this, and from what I understand, it was still bi-monthly, and it only became monthly at 112. So Byrne had a lot to do with it, the X-Men becoming the successful book it became in a couple of years. That's one. The second thing I want to say is that the scene with the doe, you said it happened in what issue, 109?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a scene in 116, the very issue I referenced before, where he kills the guard, where he's like hugging and playing around with Sabu. Kazar is like big saber-toothed tiger. And Sabu is like loving him back and all this. And again, that's another nuanced part of Wolverine that you never really saw until Byrne came on the book. So I believe, just the same way I believe that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee would get together and talk about a story beforehand, that Claremont and Byrne contacted each other and they decided on these little bits. Because again, before Byrne came, you never saw him doing anything with a doe or with a saber tooth or anything that side of his personality. So Byrne was a big contribution to showing nuance to the character.
What an interesting fact that, we generally associate Byrne with wanting Wolverine to be more volatile and Claremont with him wanting to be more human. And yet Claremont in his first scripts has Wolverine being as murderous as ever. And Byrne in his first scripts is showing this other tender side to Wolverine and this desire to exhibit self-control and to be more sort of one with nature and one with animals.
And yet
interesting contrast.
Yeah, and yeah, he could go 1 to 100 miles an hour in a second.
Sure, but at least he had that range.
Yeah.
Yes, it absolutely is, and it makes him so much more interesting. You're right.
Yep.
So Byrne's contribution is inevitably important. I know George will argue that doesn't make him a creator in any shape or form. But,
you're going to keep on with that, aren't you?
Well,
something
my point
is created, and I'm not saying it's not made better or worse by the other artists, but the point is that you have to have something to spring off of.
Well, I guess I'd put it this way. For example, let's say that you are a non-comic book fan who enjoys the X-Men movies, and Hugh Jackman is your favorite and Wolverine is your favorite.
Yes, he is.
That character didn't begin to exist until John Byrne.
Okay.
The character that existed before that is not the character Hugh Jackman is playing.
You can argue the actual character that the actor is playing is nothing to do with the comic books too, but...
Oh, you could do that, absolutely, but you can at least see Byrne's influence on it. Whereas,
they're going to take things from the source material, which is everybody, because that's the way the comics are. You have a different.
But it's not everybody, though, because the way that, if you want to take the Wein Wolverine, he's not in that movie at all.
Well, they did take things from the Claremont Frank Miller miniseries as well. So
yeah, and that was later on, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about creator, you're right. If I went to Key Collector, the app right now, and looked up creator, it would give a definition very similar to yours. Who did it first? That's what collectors care about. When we're talking about actual authorship, and we're talking about where the character really came from, you can have the person who first wrote it, and you can have the person who made it, who gave it the characteristics, who gave it the soul and personality that people want to replicate and emulate and read about again and again. And really, you're helping to sell this idea that John Byrne immensely both softened up and intensified the character at the same time, giving him the range that fans look for to this day.
I don't want to downplay what the following artists did, people that came afterwards, because of course that's major. There's a big influence. I'm just saying that the creator is the creator. You can't go back and say, well, John Byrne created Wolverine, because he didn't. I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying that he wasn't better than Len Wein. Probably was. I'm just saying the creator has to get the credit for coming up with the idea, and then other people take the baton and make it better or worse. Hopefully better. If they make it worse, it disappears.
Maybe we need a different word for it then. I get in this fight all the time. I'm a high school teacher, for those of you who don't know listening. And I enrage my students every year, and I introduce them to Shakespeare and explain to them that Shakespeare created almost no original characters. We read Romeo and Juliet, and I'm like, he didn't make up the story. He ripped off the plot elements and the character names from somebody else, but what he added to it is what people remember. The reason why Shakespeare's perpetually associated with Romeo and Juliet is he gave them characteristics, and he added things to that story that made it all so much more memorable than what the people beforehand had done. And
I didn't know that. What are you telling me? He didn't create Romeo and Juliet?
Or Hamlet, or Macbeth. No, Macbeth he didn't make either.
Macbeth was, weren't some of them actual characters?
Legends.
Real life people? Yeah.
Some were real life, some were legends, some were previous plays and stories done by other people. Basically, he just, whenever possible, he just stole other people's ideas and made them better. And he didn't lie about that. There was no deception about it whatsoever. He never claimed he created them. But the reason that he's remembered and they're not is because he kind of John Byrned them. And that's me actually speaking highly of John Byrne. Oh my gosh. I heard myself there and I want to throw up a little bit.
John Byrned them.
I am not usually a Byrne fan, but in the case of Wolverine, it's unmistakable how much he recreated that character. And that's what Shakespeare did for his characters as well.
We might be going off on a tangent, but I'm going to say this. If it wasn't for Starlin, Adam Warlock would have went away. If it wasn't for Neil Adams, maybe Batman goes away. If it wasn't for John Byrne, maybe Wolverine goes away.
So, should we talk Frank Miller next? Is that where we're
Mm.
headed?
Yeah, I mean, I do think in the context of Frank Miller, I will say that I think there's certain antecedents to what he and Claremont did, but making him more thoughtful, meditative, at peace, and also showing him taking on some damage. Um, you see little bits of that in Cockrum's second run during the Brood storyline, where Wolverine has a brood egg in him, and he's trying to deal with that internally and kind of like meditative and self-aware about that, and he's also getting the crap beat out of him. So I do think Claremont started these threads. So it wasn't just born out of nothing from Claremont and Miller, but that collaboration really, like, you look at the issues and just visually they're so stunning, and you kind of convey like the inner life of Wolverine, I think, in very effective ways.
Yeah,
um
I agree with you that I think they're just extenuating things that were already done by Claremont and Byrne before that. And I've always felt that Miller's involvement is overrated. I generally feel that Miller is overrated. That's a conversation for another day, except for with Daredevil. But
Oh boy.
I think the big thing that he added, that this whole idea of Wolverine seeing himself as a samurai, I just didn't care about. And then, Claremont continued that with the Kitty Pryde and Wolverine miniseries afterwards, which Miller was not a part of, where Kitty Pryde is now basically a ninja. And I wasn't feeling that part either. So I'm not sure why Miller is important to Wolverine's development, but I know that everybody else puts him on that map and discusses him, so I felt that he should be here for this conversation. But I'd
I
love for one of you to prove me wrong on this one. What did Miller add that was important?
Not so fast there, Skippy. I'm gonna say it is.
There it is.
Yeah.
I was waiting for it.
Okay. The reason why Frank Miller is important is because he challenged Claremont to make Wolverine something more than a guy who's just angry. So, because Claremont signed off on the angry thing, he didn't want him to give him a backstory or any kind of nobility or anything like that. So they went there. So now you're saying that you think that Miller gets too much credit. I think that the whole ninja everything was a nod to all the work he had done on Daredevil with all that ninja stuff, and it added a different air to it. And I like that Wolverine got his ass kicked a lot in this in this 4 issue miniseries, and there was also in a part, I think it was issue 2, where he gets totally beat up, that he just goes on a drinking bender with like that crazy other person. What was her name?
Yukio.
Yukia. He goes on a
Yukio.
crazy drinking bender with her drinking and I guess having sex with her all over the place. Like he just gave up. So he didn't come out looking too noble and all this. So what he did have was that he kept coming back. And that's what it was. It was almost like he was tenacious enough to not give up. But I like that he wasn't just Superman. And you see, James says that he was getting more abilities and getting things added too. But I didn't feel that was this miniseries. Didn't get anything added. He was always at the losing end of most of these fights. But
Yeah.
it gave him a little more character, and it gave him a. I think that miniseries catapulted him to the next level, and Frank Miller gets all the credit for that, because if it was somebody like Al Milgrom who did the Kitty Pryde and the Wolverine miniseries, it would have been a big zero. Sorry, Al.
Yeah, like I said, I think that there are antecedents. There's history with like Wolverine and Mariko, and whenever you had stories with the two of them, you got the softer side of Wolverine, thoughtfulness, meditative. So it's not like it comes from whole cloth, but I do see it is a little bit of the start of some of the stuff that I think would lead to Wolverine fatigue. And he did, George mentioned Yukio. Uh, Here, you used to have Wolverine getting rejected by Jean. She wants to be with Cyclops. This love triangle is illusory at that point. But here you have him juggling women. And when you get to Kitty Pryde and Wolverine, the miniseries that Milgram draws, I think at one point he's hanging out at one of the homes that the Yoshida clan, Mariko's family owns, and he's there with Yukio, and it's implied that they're, you know, physically involved there, and it's just like that seems really disrespectful if you're going to use
Yes.
one of Mariko's own homes. If I mean, granted, she had dumped him under the control of Mastermind Mariko back in the main book, after the events of the miniseries. But don't do it in one of her homes. Come on, man.
I
Oh
think
boy.
the idea of Wolverine in a relationship is such a strange idea to begin with for me. It just doesn't seem like he has the skills one would need to be in a give and take relationship. But I think I always liked viewing his relationships from the outside as opposed to in. I liked when he and Mariko were thinking X-Men and watching everyone go, what how is that? What does she see in him? It's like constantly implied. What is Wolverine like behind closed doors that we don't get to see? It's both a punchline and a meaningful message too about don't judge people too harshly, even if you've known them for years. When we get Wolverine's solo stories, when we see things from his perspective, you lose that. I really like Wolverine on so many levels works best as a mystery. And I like not being in his head. I like watching other characters try to understand what's in his head from a distance more than these solo stories, I think.
And
Jeff,
that's
Go I'm
ahead.
sorry. I never thought that Wolverine worked outside of a team book.
Yeah.
I only think I think maybe this is the exception, the 4-issue miniseries, and even that, it was cool because of the team up of Frank Miller and Claremont. But I just never saw. I don't know how he got his own miniseries, his own series, and there was a point he had 2 series at the same time, and then that's when it took off in the '90s, where he's like in everybody's book. But I always felt he's better in an ensemble cast than just by himself.
That might set us up a little for talking about, and you referred to this earlier on, Wolverine as mentor. Kitty Pryde, Jubilee, Rogue in the movies. I mentioned LCD and Albert earlier on. There's this tendency to constantly make Wolverine be the gritty mentor to a bright and boisterous sidekick. And where do you think that came from? And is that important to understanding who Wolverine is as a character?
As far as him being mentor to, I tuned out. I'm just not a Wolverine fan, and I think the whole thing was inane. Him looking after little kids or whatever. I don't know what they were trying to do. I mean, I guess people are still buying it, I guess.
It reminds me of those adorable T-shirts they made with like Darth Vader holding a young Princess Leia by the hand and walking her. Something that clearly never happened, but it's an adorable idea because we'd like to believe a character as dark and imposing as Darth Vader could be a good daddy inside. Yeah. And I can't help but wonder if pairing Wolverine with Kitty Pryde and later with Jubilee and with all these other characters, if it's that kind of a cheap stunt. Let's take the grim and gritty guy and show that he has a heart deep down inside. Or you could see it as an evolution of the character and a sign of how far he's come from being this berserk, wild, murderous animal in the beginning. James, where do you see it?
I mean, I think it's sort of Claremont trying to, again, foreground Wolverine. And, granted, the Kitty Pryde series, miniseries, Kitty Pryde and Wolverine is early on. But also, when he builds up the love triangle sort of retroactively and retconning with Wolverine and Jean Grey and Cyclops, I think it's part of like trying to make this guy a like romantic sort of lead. And if Wolverine is like a great father figure, and a sweet nice guy, especially to younger female characters, it's Kitty, it's it's Jubilee, it's LCD, it's Rogue from the movies. Then like he's more workable as like the romantic lead. So some of that developed when I think Claremont was upset about how they retconned the Phoenix story. They had Jean Grey come back. She's actually alive at the bottom of Jamaica Bay. And you have Cyclops effectively like leave Madeline Pryor at home in Alaska to join X Factor. And that I think it kind of ruined the character of Cyclops for Claremont. And then he builds up Wolverine in contrast. He builds up the whole backstory of like, hey, maybe there was a mutual attraction between Wolverine and Jean. And I think one of those legs of that table is like, this is a nice guy. He's like your nice dad, you know? Like deep down inside, he'd be sweet with the kids. So see him as like a romantic leading man rather than like your character actor.
Who on the one hand consoles Kitty Pryde and pats her on the back, and then as soon as she leaves the room, he invites Yukio in and they do it on Kitty's bed.
Yes, and like I said before, he stabbed Rachel. She's not that old, you know. Like I don't know if she's supposed to be like 19 or something like that in the story when that happened.
It just doesn't all fit together.
James, not every idea is a good idea. Not every direction is a good direction. I mean,
Yeah.
I was looking at some of the big runs that people have done. And generally, over the last 40 years or so, from the 80s on, the successful runs that you saw were a writer staying on a book maybe 3 years tops. And then after that, they kind of run out of ideas, and then you move on to the next guy. Well, Chris Claremont stayed too long to the dance.
Yeah.
I feel that. I mean, Kitty Pryde, and come on, man. And then trying to make Logan a nice guy after all. No, he's not a nice guy.
I just think you can't have your cake. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Go one direction or the other. You want to make him a fallen, tragic character who follows a very different code of conduct than we do? Fine. You want to make him Daddy of the Year? Fine. You can't do both. So, moving forward a little bit in our timeline at this point, getting to post-Claremont, talking about, Jim Lee and Scott Lobdell and Fabian DeSenza and everyone else who came afterwards, sort of prior to, I guess we're stopping at 2000, both because that's when the first movie drops and that's right before Origin, which, as far as I'm concerned, was a wild departure for the character. What else of note do you think happened during that time period that's worthy of discussion for evolving Wolverine as a character, or it might even be considered a creative contribution to who he is?
I mean, to be honest, I'm not too enamored of that. I mean, I think what Hama did, a lot of the stuff was turning stuff off to 11 or 12 on the meter, whereas Claremont and some of the later period has Wolverine taking a lot of damage, like you know. Hama does a lot of that. It's Wolverine the masochist, gets beat up left and right, and really expands his powers in that sense. You can have him in a lot more heavy duty fights and things like that. It does it makes it a little less grounded and a little more absurd that you can push the envelope for that. And again, he does take things around the bend. He takes, he works off of like the Weapon X serial that Barry Windsor Smith does, and he tries to do some threads with that, like I mentioned with Silver Fox and with Sabretooth. To be honest, that's not something I've been too interested in rereading, so it's a little messy in my mind, but it's a lot of like retcons and making things a little more convoluted. So I don't know, in a sense of like developing the character in like a clean, easy to follow fashion. I don't know if there's, you know, much in that way. It's more of complicating things. Like you say, Jeff, we've developed so much history, so many years have racked up, and it's a lot more complications and twists and turns and things.
Yeah. And I think you have two other really difficult constraining factors that kind of make this a gray period for Wolverine, where not much remarkable happens to him other than Bone Claws. Where, first of all, he does have his own solo title at this point. So it is very, very hard to do anything consequential that affects him without working that out amongst all the X-Men titles at this point and the Wolverine title at the same time.
Yeah.
And number two, this is now the era of the anti-hero, where we're constantly getting new characters who are super edgy, or making old characters edgier to the point that Wolverine almost becomes irrelevant because, yeah, he's a badass who might be a killer, but Cable's even more so. And yeah, he doesn't quite follow the social etiquette norms we're used to and is kind of an outlier in the team, but Strong Guy's even more so. And like, he kind of gets eclipsed and dwarfed as a result of that as well.
Yeah, I mean earlier issues of Wolverine, where you had Claremont, and then you had some very short runs from like Peter David. You had a Byrne come back for a story. You had, it was Wolverine doing his own thing. Some of it as Patch and some elsewhere, but it's very disconnected and not constrained by the X-Men books. And after Ham has been there for a bit, they start drawing things in more. You have Jubilee showing up at his title. You have the Bone Claws, right? You have Fatal Attractions, the metal being drawn out of him. So you're really a lot more constrained and going back to more of your standard superhero,
How about Wolverine and other media? The animated series in the 90s, the Bryan Singer film in 2000. Wolverine is being introduced to new audiences. People who grew up with the animated series, know Wolverine primarily as part of the Scott Summers Phoenix Wolverine love triangle, which was there in the comic, but not as much. If you grew up on the Bryan Singer film and you think Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, he is and he isn't. What thoughts do you have on this, either of you?
The only version of Wolverine that I really, really like is a Hugh Jackman version. In fact, I'll go as far to say as I think I might have a man crush on Hugh Jackman. He was fantastic and stole every one of those movies. And I'll tell you this, I even like Wolverine Origins, the one that everybody hates. I watched that movie over and over again. I love him in that movie. He steals every one of those movies. And I don't care if he's 6 feet. I don't care about any of the other stuff. He plays the character great, and I'll watch anything that he does with Wolverine. As a matter of fact, I'm roping my wife into going to see Deadpool Wolverine in about a week or so.
I won't argue with that on any part of that, including the man crush. I might consider going gay for Hugh Jackman. He might be worth it. But
I won't go that far, but I got a man crush. Okay.
Even in his bad movies, you're right. He's always good. And yet he's a very sanitized version of Wolverine. He's not as murderous and dangerous as that Wolverine could be. He certainly doesn't strike me as the kind of character who could do a lot of things the comic book versions did. He feels, even though Disney didn't own X-Men or Marvel at this point, he feels like a Disney-fied version of Wolverine to me.
No.
Yeah. I mean, in the movies, I kind of have a divided opinion. I believe it or not, the one that I haven't seen is X-Men Origins Wolverine. Maybe that's good because it's supposedly not that great.
I love that movie. That movie's great.
I have seen all the others. I like Hugh Jackman in solo Wolverine movies. I think that's great. In the team movies, the X-Men movies, I feel like it's another symptom of like trying to make him the star of everything. So like again, as someone who's a Cyclops fan, it was really let's dump on this character of Cyclops to elevate Wolverine, or
Mm-hmm.
like let's make it really a movie about one guy and the other people are his supporting cast. So, like to me, like when I see an X-Men movie, I want to see like an ensemble. I want to see a team. I want to see everybody with contributions. And I feel like sometimes, like his Wolverine cut back on that with the way the screenwriters did that. But yes, he's a very charismatic character. Hugh Jackman is an iconic performance, even though it's the softer, nicer side of Wolverine. It's not a short, ugly dude. Um, there's a reason why they keep on bringing him back. The animated
I think
series,
you're wrong about
yeah,
that, man. Hugh Jackman steals those movies. He's great. I don't think he's a soft version at all. I think at the very first movie, he's in that bar fighting for money, and when he gets chased out, what was her name? Rogue says, "Oh, I don't have anywhere to go." He goes, "Well, it's not my problem." And she goes, "Oh, you don't care." He goes, "You don't care, or you don't care," or he says some line. He goes, "Take your pick. I don't give a crap." So he's getting ready to leave her off. No, he's not a soft virgin at all. He doesn't
By the
want to be
second movie,
bothered.
he's the babysitter, man.
Yeah.
Is he the babysitter? I forget the second.
They
one.
literally
The second
call
one was
him that.
But he was great in all those, even the cameos he steals.
And I'll say, too, as much as this is a little outside of our scope of 1974 to 2000, I think the one time they do his mentor-mentee relationship absolutely right is in Logan. That is absolutely 100% earned. That movie made me cry. That is a perfect film. It is one of the best Wolverine stories ever told.
It was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like both the Wolverine and Logan. Yeah, those are really well done movies. As far as the animated series go, 'cause I know there's people of a certain age, maybe slightly younger than me, but in that ballpark, that love the animated series. I was never quite so crazy about it because I felt reading the comics at the same time, it was like a watered down and simplistic, and the voice acting was a little over the top at times. I like the revival, the X-Men 97. I think handles that a little better. But I agree with you, Jeff, that it draws a lot on the retconning work that Claremont did after the originals are spun out into X Factor to build up the love triangle more. So that was like a big thing there. But and you get plenty of memes out of that, right?
Oh
Looking
my
at the
gosh, yes.
photo. But I was never too crazy about that.
No, I respected what the animated series did. I respected that it tried harder to go hardcore into continuity than any previous comic adaptation had, and yet it still came up short. And it took a lot of liberty with it. It made a lot of changes I felt were unnecessary, and I do think X-Men '97 is a much better version of that fixed that a lot too.
Yeah.
But I think what's important is that it was the first real pop culture understanding of who Wolverine was, and it also sort of smoothed him out a bit and showed that he could get angry, but he wasn't a murderous animal. He was an angry dude with claws who could also be a hot lover that you might root for in a triangle.
Yeah, I mean, I remember he had like one or maybe two guest appearances in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. There was the Pride of the X-Men cartoon, but they didn't really develop the character. Like, this is where you actually get some character development for people that aren't reading the comics.
Yeah, and I think one of the first impressions you get of him is what a good friend he is to Morph, which is like not really what we think of. But so I think that makes sense, is when you're trying to appeal to a wider audience, you tend to soften the character a bit. Yeah, so I guess that's the importance of their in the evolution of Wolverine. There is that they made him more appealing, but they also made him a little bit more lovable. And that's not a word I would have used to describe Wolverine in his first 2 decades.
They dumbed down the character. As far as cartoons, I don't watch cartoons. I'm not 10 years old. I don't watch cartoons.
You're missing some good ones then.
Well, then I'm missing good ones. How can I say I don't watch cartoons?
All right, so the big final question, putting this all together, looking at Wolverine's complex evolution from 1974 to 2000, looking at all the creative forces that were involved, right down to decisions actors made. I know what George's answer is going to be. What do you think? And I want to be very clear. I'm not asking who created Wolverine. I'm asking who should be credited for Wolverine's success. Theoretically, in a more just comic book industry, that's what people should be compensated for and applauded for. Not who did it first, but who did it so well that it became a sensation. Who do you credit for Wolverine's success?
Go ahead, James.
For me, I do agree with George in the sense that you at least have to have a starting point. So, you do have to give Wein and I think Romita Sr. their props because, scripted the first story, drew the original character sketch. But I think if Byrne doesn't come along, does Wolverine get written out of the series, eventually become like a marginal character? I think Byrne was like key to like let's center stories around Wolverine. Claremont, when Wolverine gets more foregrounded and Byrne brings that element of that. He did so many things with the character and tried to continue to evolve him. So they're both key. Byrne's sort of a catalyst, and Claremont has added so much to the mythos that maybe there are ideas that Byrne wouldn't have done on his own because um, I don't think a Byrne Claremont Wolverine miniseries is anything like the Claremont Miller miniseries.
That's all incredibly well said.
Thank you.
George, you want to go next, or you want me to take the next one? It's up to you.
I'll take the next one. I think. Look, it was created by Len Wein and John Romita Sr., but they almost did nothing. So I'm not going back on my answer. They're still the creators, but they did. They were just like, okay, here's the idea, and handed it off. So they didn't really do anything to these characters. You have to give Chris Claremont a lot of credit first because he kept the book going, and I think John Byrne gets the most credit because he championed the character, made him more nuanced, and gave him. I mean, the visuals are so important to comic books. Writing is one thing. The visual has to be there, and also, if I have to add a third name, it'd be Frank Miller, because he exploded after that miniseries. So it'd be Claremont, Byrne, and Miller.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I think that's really insightful, and I think Romita should not be underplayed. I think the moment he gave this hero, or this potential hero, claws, whether or not he meant anything by it, it set Wolverine on a path. This character has to be darker. This character has to be more troubled. You can't go into battle with this and be a squeaky clean hero. This is going to be different. Sure, Roy Thomas said he should be fierce first, but you could argue Spider-Man fights with ferocity, maybe. I don't know. It's those claws, I think, that really set Wolverine on a different path. And this is really where you could argue this is almost a tinfoil hat theory.
Tinfoil hat theory.
I think, in a sense, the creation of Wolverine set the entire comic industry in a direction that was damaging and highlights both the strengths and the weaknesses of Wolverine and what different creators did right and did wrong with him, which is as soon as we had this sort of murderous anti-hero on a popular comic book team, I don't think it's an accident that Frank Miller does the Wolverine miniseries and then does Dark Knight Returns only a short while afterwards. And, Batman, people always say Wolverine's a Batman ripoff. I hear that all the time. But I would argue Miller's Batman was a Wolverine ripoff. He's dark. He's out of control. He's ready to kill if he has to. But he missed what made Wolverine special. And so did all those anti-heroes that followed that could kill on a moment's notice. And they're so badass. And they're so dark. But what they missed was what Claremont had done and what Byrne had done. Claremont was showing the importance of having a team around you. And what that darkness does to accentuate the heroism in those who are trying to help you. And Byrne instituted that self-control. That idea that he can track a doe and not kill it. The idea that he can go to 100, but he can also be at a 1, and he can bond with an animal, and he can find these immensely serene moments that, Miller later played off of, but then missed the point of when he did Dark Knight Returns, rather. I think, in a sense, I would love to go back to the 80s and 90s where every character had to be so badass and so dark and say, you missed the point when you looked at Wolverine as a template. And thus I'd argue that Claremont and Byrne were really the primary deciding factors in what made Wolverine great. But maybe since everybody missed the point, that really doesn't matter. Maybe what it really came down to is ferocity and claws. Maybe that's what most people understand about Wolverine that seems important to them. In which case it goes back to Thomas and it goes back to what John Romita did. I think maybe for a lot of people it really is just the claws and the ferocity. But for what I love about Wolverine and what I think makes him a great character, and certainly what Hugh Jackman is channeling and what the animated series is channeling, it's Claremont and Byrne.
Yeah, I just think the Romita and the claws, that's interesting.
They were forced to go in a direction. You had no choice at that point. You committed to that. Except I will say, again, with the swordsman and somebody like Hawkeye that's shooting an arrow that'll go right through your body, they kind of made the point to avoid obvious consequences of those types of weapons. Yeah. But I guess sharp claws, you just can't get around it.
Well, at least if you're talking about Hawkeye and a bow, and of course Green Arrow before him, there was a sense that it was more civil and less dangerous than a gun. It was a more harmless range weapon. And, but with Wolverine with claws, I mean, if you have a gun and someone's standing, 50 feet away and they have a bow and arrow, the gun wins. But if they're 50 feet away and they have claws, you think, what if this guy gets close to me? And especially once you add the invulnerability factor, you're like, oh, crap. There's a savageness to the claws that isn't there necessarily in a bow and arrow. And maybe not even so much in a sword, because we're so used to seeing, King Arthur and Sir Gawain the Green Knight and all these, heroic figures with swords that we don't see lopping people's heads off all the time. I would love to pick, Romita's brain and know where the claws came from, because Thomas takes no credit for it. So did he just decide ferocious?
No, I mean...
enormous claws.
Isn't that what a Wolverine has? He has claws. All he did was look at the animal and say, okay, let me make a human avatar of the animal.
Sure, but it's got fangs too.
Or maybe, already left the fangs out.
Bats have wings. Batman doesn't.
Yeah, he does. The cape.
In some versions. So I just think it was an interesting choice, especially in a Comics Code approved era, to give him claws. And before they decided they were actually part of his body, that meant he was putting them on as a choice every single time he went out to fight. And that also meant the Canadian government sanctioned that and said, that's a good thing. You go out there with claws and see what happens.
Canadians don't care.
As long as he says sorry afterwards, it's okay.
Just say sorry.
Or sorry. gotta get your Canadian vowels.
There we go.
Hey, Rockford Raiders gonna be mad at us.
Nah, he speaks in French anyway. We're talking about the other side of Canada. That's not his people. All right, guys.
Yeah, nobody's offended by that.
Well, James, you were an absolute pleasure to have on today. Your knowledge and your passion for this is immense. I'm so glad we had you on board, man. Thank you.
Thank you. I try.
And you succeed. And George, thank you for not getting too mad at me over the Deadpool fiasco. I will apologize to you. I want to say now, I'm so sorry that you don't see the amazingness of Nightcrawler. So there's the apology you wanted.
Me too.
It's okay, man. You can like what you like, and I can like what I like. Look, you like Nightcrawler, and I like Glory.
I knew you were going to say. You just compared Kurt Wagner to Glory. I love you anyway, man. It's okay.
Glory is Wonder Woman done right.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for an awesome time today. And let's not forget to thank Paul King for writing, recording, and performing the CCF In Depth theme song. Big thank you to our Patreon supporters, including Bill Sinclair, Michael Gallagher, Paolo Zakedu, Tim Schneider in Berkeley. You help us keep the lights on, and even though you can't see the lights are on, I assure you they are. On a more serious note, I do want to take a moment to dedicate this episode to the memory of Marty Golia, who was a longtime member of the Classic Comics Forum. He was one of our earliest Patreon supporters, and he was a good friend. Marty, this one's for you. This episode was, believe it or not, originally over 3 hours long, and it took a lot of editing to get it down to about half that, because we know some people don't have the patience for a 3-hour podcast. But if you're a big enough fan, if you enjoyed this and you want to hear more, well, that means that you just might be right to join the ranks of the... As a member of this secret elite society, you'll get access to the full 3-hour version of this original podcast, uncut, unedited, and before I made all those changes to make myself sound smarter than George. Shh, don't tell him. But there's a treasure trove of things there for people who really enjoy what we do, including our semi-regular series, Off the Cuff, where George and I have more informal discussions about a variety of topics related to classic comic books and classic comic book collecting. In addition to that, you'll find the extended CCF In Depth theme song, some crazy photoshopped pictures that my mother probably shouldn't see, and a variety of other fun things, in addition to being able to talk in a private, secret, elite environment with other fans. So, to get all that, Check us out at patreon.com/the Classic Comics Forum. If you need more conversation, check out classiccomics.org and find us there. And don't forget to find us here next month for our next episode. Have a great one.
Classic Comics, the Classic Comics Forum and Dave. Snappy conversations with your hosts George and Jeff. Oh, Classic Comics, the Classic Comics Forum and Dave. Talking about old comic books is the thing that they love the best. Get your hands on my comic books.
ClassicComics.org